Good morning, everybody. My name's Amy. I'm from Evershed, Sutherland. I am one of the people on the committee for the Women in Health and Safety group. Today we have a fantastic webinar hosted by Amy McKeown on how to support women, their health and mental health in the workplace. Amy is a consultant that has worked for over 20 years in this space, and she's going to share with us some insights and kind of learnings from her time of advising a whole range of different organisations on their wellbeing plans and strategies. We hope that you will find the session really helpful. We would really encourage a bit of engagement through the session. So if you could use the chat box, which is along the bottom toolbar, to put any questions or observations, we can pick them up as we go through. If we miss any points, we'll also deal with it at the end, because I know Amy's got a lot of stuff she'd want to share with you. So we will pick up particularly any themes that are coming through on the comments. At the end of the session, in the chat box, we will put a little link to a feedback survey. Can I trouble you to fill that out before you leave? Because it's really important to us in terms of when we're planning our next events to make sure that we're capturing and covering things that will help you and help other members in the network. So that would be fantastic. Similarly, the committee and those who help organise these events and all of the other wonderful things that the Women in Health and Safety Forum does always appreciate more help and support. So if you enjoy what we put out and you think you could contribute either in terms of hosting an event, whether a kind of webinar or in person or in any other way to the work of the committee, please can you get in touch with either Heather or I? That would be really, really appreciated. Fine. Well, without much further ado, I will pass over to Amy. And welcome, Amy. Thank you very much for hosting this session. Hand over to you.
Thank you, and thanks, and hello to everybody. Thank you for joining me this morning. And yeah, so I'm going to rattle through. I've got a lot of content to cover. I've tried to give lots of different bits in there, so I'm going to go at quite a clip. That said, I've got my chat open. If something comes up and you want to ask a question, do. If you've got a comment, do. I mean, I'm good at following chat and talking at the same time. And I think sometimes if something crops up that you want me to explain more or you don't understand or you want to comment on, then I think it makes it a bit more interactive as well. So my invitation to you all is that you do use the chat and I'll keep an eye on it. So let me explain who I am. So this is me, Amy McKeown. I've been in health and mental health for 20 years now as a sort of accident of birth. I fell into it because my father was a psychiatrist who specialised in stress, anxiety, depression. I guess I'm most known for putting in large organisational policies. So at Ernst & Young, I wrote and implemented their health and mental health strategy. And I now work as an independent doing all sorts, but kind of big. I just did the EU Parliament's mental health strategy. But I've been in women's health in my kind of personal life for 20 years. It's always been a sort of side interest of mine that I'm now really excited to be bringing more into the work I do, hence talks like this. So I'm now helping quite a lot of organizations on their journey around women's health and mental health. It's kind of finally come to the fore a bit. So what I'm going to be covering today, I'm trying to get a lot of content into not very much time, so bear with me. But what is women's health and mental health and why is it important? I think that is the key. And then cognitive labor and the social expectations, because this really affects women's bodies, and especially in the workplace. Understanding and working with natural cycles, I think that's important. And then I've very much framed this talk as what we can do in the workplace. So there's a little bit about understanding the individual impact, but it's more about what we can do to make the workplace more accessible for women and women's health. So some interesting stats for you. We have 15 million women employed in the UK, which is 49.5% of the working population now, which I think is really interesting. But we also have a situation where up to the age of 55, women have more healthcare needs and more time off due to women-focused conditions. I'm going to talk about that. What a women-focused condition is. And then there's some stuff here that I think is really relevant because we're talking about health and mental health, and health and mental health is about our bodies. You know, our bodies are affected by our society. So 54,000 women a year lose their jobs due to pregnancy and maternity. 77% of working mums have encountered some discrimination. We just don't raise, 1% raise a tribunal claim, but if you raise a tribunal claim, you're likely to lose anyway. And I think what's really interesting is that we do 60% more domestic and unpaid labor. That's gone up since the pandemic. And globally, women do 90% of the work, earn 3% of the money, and own 10% of the world's property. All really important when we're talking about women's health and mental health. And move on. Since the pandemic, the pandemic stats are starting to come out now. We're starting to see the impact of the pandemic. And what we know is that young people were hardest hit. Women were more impacted than men, and that mental disorders have gone up, but especially so in women. Yes, Dawn, menopause women are the fastest growing demographic. Yeah. So, yeah, we've got a really interesting situation. And Dawn, to your point, more women are working longer. So yes, there are more people in the workplace with menopause as well. So demographics are changing, but we don't really think about women's health, right? So all of the stats above impact. So women, we're more likely to have chronic conditions than men. So women are more likely to have chronic conditions, we're more likely to have autoimmune conditions. We talk more about mental health conditions. But where I'm struggling in my world of mental health is that there's a lot of discussion in mental health at the moment about men's mental health and getting men to talk about it. And somewhere along the way, we've forgotten that women have higher rates of some mental health conditions. So we have higher rates of depression and anxiety. We have in some conditions that both sexes get, women have different symptoms to men, so specifically bipolar and schizophrenia. And we have a load of health disorders, physical and mental, that are unique to women. So hormone changes, your endometriosis, PMDD, all of the kind of perimenopausal and perinatal depressions, all sorts. I've got a nice slide on this in a minute, but women are different to men. Like, it's not rocket science. We have different bodies to men. And we don't know a lot about women's bodies. And that's something that, why I do this work and why I love this work. We do not research women's bodies. We don't know a huge amount. This sort of field of women's health and mental health is really only starting to be talked about. What is women's health? So a report came out earlier this year from McKinsey. It's called Unlocking Opportunities in Women's Healthcare. And this was the first report that actually really looked at women's health. And their definition, and I put the whole thing in here because I think it's really important. Women's and men's bodies are programmed differently from birth. Every cell has a sex, and sex-based differences influence all tissues, organs, and bodily functions. And these sex-related differences affect disease prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. McKinsey also made the point that because women are often the caretakers, if we focus on women's health rather than ignoring it, as we have been doing it sort of since decades began, then it has cascading benefits for groups such as children and the elderly. So if we actually focus on women's health and look after women better, it contributes a hugely significant way to stronger and healthier societies. And women's health encompasses much more than just reproduction. And if I'm going to be a little bit facetious here, I'd say, and also the menopause, because the menopause quite rightly is getting a lot of coverage now. But women's health is not just reproduction or the menopause. And the definition that McKinsey takes is a deliberately broad approach. So they're talking about female-specific conditions, whether tied to reproduction or a facet of women's biology, and general health conditions that may affect women differently or disproportionately. So again, this is from the McKinsey report, but we've got what women's health is. So, as I said, we talk a lot about menopause and fertility, but actually women's health, there's a huge amount of general health conditions. So if you are a woman, you are 50% more likely to die from a heart attack than if you're a man. And the simple reason for that is that cardiovascular disease affects women differently. And we have been conditioned as a society to look at men's symptoms. So for example, we regard like pain down the left arm as a symptom of a heart attack. That is a male symptom. For women, it's more likely to present as a, gut thing. I've lost my train of thought. reflux. We don't know, because we've not studied sex differences, things like Alzheimer's. We know that things like autoimmune disease, migraines, osteoporosis affect women disproportionately. And we know that there's a gender bias in care delivery. So we know that there's these big differences. We just don't actually do it. And also female specific conditions, gynecology, gynecological stuff, and women's oncology. So women's health is a broad brush. This is the health of women: cognitive, aging, bone health, kidney disease. It's not just menopause and fertility. Now, I think you made this point, Marina, but this is a really nice slide also from that report, which is that we actually only spend 1% of healthcare research and innovation is invested in female specific conditions. And if you look at medtech, we're actually only focusing 2% on medtech on female conditions. So women's health is the sort of poor cousin, but like 1% is just shocking. Yes, Dawn, absolutely shocking. So this is a really good report to get because, we just don't cover it. No, Dawn is saying, I don't know whether to be enlightened or scared. I think both, and that's why I love doing this work, because in all of the chat about men's health and getting men to talk about it, women is also becoming the default, so the niche. So what happens with women? There's a lack of research. I've just covered that. So we do 1%. Women are more likely to be misdiagnosed. So there's imbalanced service design and data, because the cultural bias that you're talking about, Carly, is to do with our healthcare system. There's a lack of access to the healthcare system for women because of domestic and family responsibilities. Women have low health literacy. And also there's a load of evidence now that shows that women, because of the way that medicine and mental health has kind of been structured, we're likely to be not believed. Right. So there is the hysteria. Hysteria was a mental illness. That's sort of women are hysterical. Women, it takes a lot longer to get diagnosed for illnesses because we're not believed. And I mean, I love the example of the COVID vaccine menstrual cycle. I, like many other women, had a menstrual cycle impact after I had my COVID vaccine. 100,000 women came forward in the UK to say that they had issues with their cycle after the COVID vaccine. And the response from the Royal College of Gynecology was that women's cycles change all the time and women didn't know what they were talking about. Interestingly, it was Al Jazeera and Dubai, an Arab country, that did the first research on the COVID vaccine response on the cycle. So, we're not believed when we do actually come forward. And Marina, yes, this is so common. I've got a really great book on this here, Doing Harm. I've got some books at the end for you, but it's about, you get misdiagnosis and chronic conditions. It's just a bit of a shock for women, right? So that's a little bit of an overview of women's health. Like I said, I'm going at a clip. What I think is important when talking about women's health is to talk about cognitive load and societal expectations, right? So what is cognitive load, right? Cognitive load is the emotional labor, the unpaid emotional labor that women do to keep everyone around them happy and comfortable, right? So that's emotional labor that we do. Women are programmed in patriarchy to make everybody else feel better and sort of shortchange themselves. Likewise, there's a mental load, which is the cognitive burden of having to keep track on what's doing around the house. And I love this little picture on the side, because it's like when a man expects his partner to ask him to do things, he's viewing her as a manager, right? So she's having to do the mental and the cognitive load. Why I think this is important is this is the reality of many women, right? And the social conditioning that we are in, the structure we are in, how we are brought up, our society, our thoughts make our world. And our social conditioning is the language we're in, the culture we're in, the conditioning, the convention, the tradition, the ingrained habits. So that we are framed by our world. And not to conform to that, people who are not conforming to our societal structure, there's guilt and there's shame. Now, for women, there's a whole aspect of this, which is that, we were shamed. We were burnt as witches. We were hysterics. If you read Freud, it's kind of women. There's a wonderful book, Women in Power by Mary Beard, that talks about women in Roman times. We are a Greco-Roman society. And actually, women were not taught, we were not educated in those times. So all of this history, affects us, and it affects how we are now. And you can see what's going on in the States, but it's all the society that women grow up in, right? So what is our health? So our health and our mental health is a construct. So it's a construct. Health is an interplay of chemicals, of hormones, of your physical health, of your emotional health, but your societal health as well, right? So for women, I think the reason that we have more chronic illness, and I think the reason we have higher rates of stress and anxiety, is because we are carrying in our bodies this societal load of being a woman in a patriarchal society. So there's the cognitive load and the mental load, but there's also the trauma in our bodies that we're just carrying around that I think is leading to those rates of illness. Right. I've got the triangle on the right, which is our thoughts, behaviors, and feelings. Some of you might have recognized that as the cognitive behavioral triangle. But what is that how we think about something affects our behavior and our feelings, right? So if we are growing up in a world where kind of it's very male dominated and women are the niche rather than the default, then this does affect us. And I mean, psychoneuroimmunology and neuroplasticity are terms that you might recognize, but psychoneuroimmunology is key here because your health and your immune system is affected by how you think and how you feel, right? So if we're in a world where women are second-class citizens, then that not only has an impact on our mental health, but it has an impact on our immunology. And there is the incidences of chronic illnesses, of autoimmune illnesses. You can change that with neuroplasticity. You can change how your brain is wired. But there is a very, very, in my mind, clear link between women in society and how you are existing that then interplays into these stress, depression, chronic illness, autoimmune illness, how things present. So, that's a little bit of an overview of health and mental health. Heather, you are absolutely right. There's a really good book called The Body Keeps the Score. It's not Peter Levine, that one, is it? I think so, but that is worth reading because that talks about this. And then Sarah said there's a great book called When the Body Says No by Dr. Gabor Mate. Yes. And so there's, we're starting to see this. There is now starting to be a recognition, but I think it's really worth talking about this because our bodies are reacting to the world in which we live. And Marina, you've said Spartan and Viking cultures were some of the only civilizations where women were respected. Yes, I think that's true. I mean, it's interesting. We're starting to see, and at the British Museum, there's a rise, there's an exhibition at the moment about women's cultures, which is worth looking at. So we've just been in patriarchy for too long, but there certainly have been cultures where women have been sort of better treated. And Carly, before I move on to cycles, you've said in ancient Egypt, women owned property, and even in the UK in medieval times, women owned businesses and ruled fortresses. It was very carefully suppressed during the Victorian era. Yes. I think the Victorians was not great for women, but I'm going to say that I think there was I'm reading a book at the moment on medieval Britain, the Time Traveller's Guides, and on the Restoration, and it was still terrible being a woman in those times as well. So yes, the Victorians were awful, but I mean, kind of the Restoration in that period was also awful. I just think women have had a bit of a bad lot all around. So cycles. This may come as a shock to you, but women are cyclical beings. And I love this diagram because this diagram shows you really clearly what is going on during a 28-day cycle, menstrual cycle, in terms of our hormones. So what you will see is the first half of the cycle is estrogen run, and the second half of the cycle is progesterone run. But why I love seeing it displayed like this is that we are not the same day in, day out. Our hormones are doing things, they're changing. This is just a 28-day cycle. So this is how much change is going on in our bodies during 28 days. And the fact that zero research we've done on drugs and on pills and on treatments looks at the impact of the female hormonal cycle on that drug or on that treatment Or even, you know, people who have got diagnosed mental illnesses, their symptoms will be worse at different times of the month. Likewise, if you've got chronic illnesses or autoimmune illnesses, they can be affected by your hormonal flow, something that we are starting to see a trickle of awareness of, but it's still really slow. Like, we're basically walking around in a world where 49% of women, well, half of the population are disembodied from what is happening in their bodies on a monthly cycle. I say this because the interest in fertility and menopause is great, but, you know, from when women go through menarche, this is what they're dealing with on a monthly basis. So for a lot of women, fertility, trying to get pregnant or not being able to get pregnant, or menopause are often the first times that you've actually thought about what's going on in a monthly cycle. So, you know, I do a lot of work on helping women to understand and track their cycle, which I'll come on to in a minute. But this is like, how can we, you know, we treat illness and mental illness as if it is a thing, when we are fluid women with hormones that are doing different things on different days. This is a lot of work on this, and I'm going to give you some books recommendations at the end, but this is shown differently. So when I am taking women through understanding their cycle, what the easiest way of doing it is by looking at the 4 seasons of the year. So when you are bleeding or menstruating, it is like winter. You know, you are tired, you need to rest, your body is doing stuff underground. That is the feeling of that. The period between your bleed and ovulation is spring. You know, your body is full of estrogen, you've got kind of spring energy. It's when women are at their most creative. If you're writing or having to do creative thought, that's a really good time in the cycle to do it. Ovulation is like summer, you know, it's the middle of July, we're in midsummer, everything's out there, it's really exposed. And then autumn, which is what society lovely calls PMS, is that, you know, in autumn, the leaves are falling down, starting to get colder, we wrap in, we get tireder, we want to go inside. That is a really natural autumn response. Now, what we see for women in PMS and PMDD is that your body is going through the 4 seasons of the year in every menstrual cycle. And that bit that we call PMS is when you want to go inward and rest, but we live in a world which is always on, 9 to 5, working every week. You know, we're not really living in a way that's honoring our body and the cycles of our body, right? So this is a really useful thing to remember as well, in that women are changing every day of the month, right? But it's generally falls into 4 seasons, and working in tune with what your body needs. So resting up more during that kind of autumn winter part of your cycle and using the energy of spring has been shown, women have been shown to be more productive over a month if they're working with their body rather than just ignoring it and plowing on kind of in the modern world. So that's a really, you know, there's a whole, I could talk about this for hours, but there's a lot of stuff now teaching women about this and teaching about menstrual cycle syncing. So that is starting to understand your cycle and then doing different things at different times of the cycle to work with it. So, you know, eating specific foods during the menstrual phase, doing gentle exercise, resting up. During the kind of spring phase, it's intense workouts, we've got a lot of energy, we eat proteins, we're doing estrogen support because that's what our cycle's been driven by. Ovulatory phase, you know, what we're doing then, and then what we do in the end of the cycle, that's clearing the estrogen out because it's progesterone run. So a lot on this now, but I think it's really relevant to the workplace because we just don't think of women doing this and living in a more cyclical way, you know, around the boundaries of we live in the modern world. But you can do things like understanding your cycle and where you're at. So there are apps. You can get a book like this, which is a menstrual cycle journal, where you write down each day how you feel. And then just gently tweaking your lifestyle to work with your body and not against it. So, and the 1% rule is, obviously we're all busy, highly successful women and men on this call. But it's about, you can just do a tweak, you know, instead of forcing yourself when you're tired and part of the cycle that you can rest, you know, just change your lifestyle 1%. And I now do, I have my cycle on the calendar at home. My children and partner know about it. I manage your expectations. I'm lucky enough that because I'm self-employed, I can build flexibility in. So I often think about if I'm doing a lot of delivery work and I'm at a point of my cycle where I am going to be tired, how I will approach that, how I will look after myself more. But this is just kind of being aware as a woman in a woman's body, how to look after oneself and one's health and mental health. So that was a real clip of women's cycles. I mean, I've got some resources on the end for you, but I think it's a really important thing because in the workplace, you're starting to see menstrual policies come in, but they're really few and far between. The menopause is big, but we're starting to see that. And there's evidence to show that women are more likely to take time off work during their period. Some women have horrendous pain. So actually putting in menstrual policies whereby women can ease off or take time off over their period can show what's happening. You have we've got Ayurveda. Yeah, we've got, so using an app. Yes, there's some brilliant apps and pains. It's very interesting. So that is, there's a good one called Clue, but there's lots of other ones. And Jennifer, what's she called? Jessica Ennis Hill has just released an app which is about syncing training and exercise with your cycle. Amy, you've put that recognizes that human beings, so, Ayurveda recognizes that human beings are different year round, depending on the seasons, hours of light, natural. Yeah, it's an ancient practice. It's an ancient practice, but for women, we've kind of forgotten that we are cyclical. We are work with the moon. Heather, are you talking about with Spain, the menstrual policies? Because I think Spain is kind of leading the way in, every day kind of it's leading the way in menstrual policies. Do we have any examples of what it's like to include the policies that like easing up or absence? I think there are. You can go on to Thrive is the website. We Thrive. Claire, she has some example policies on there. But I mean, what I really recommend to, and I'm coming on to this bit now, is that organizations figure out what's going to work with them. Just as we're all figuring out how to come back into the working world after COVID and the hybrid thing, one of the things I'm going to talk about in a second is talking to your women and finding out what will work for them in terms of, and then creating your policy from there. But I think it's really about allowing women to take time off work home from home, and just balancing out over the months the hours and the work that they're doing where you can. Obviously, if you've got client deliverables and things like that, it's more of a challenge, but just encouraging women to talk about it. And yeah, I'm sorry to hear that, Michaela. With endometriosis, it's an opportunity. Every day is a battle. Yeah. I mean, but I think a battle that's starting to be recognized now, we're starting to talk about it more. So I'm going to just whiz through now what workplaces can do, because I think that's where the key is, right? So there's a lot chatting about women in the workplace and lots of organizations where you have to now do your gender pay gap. But I think there's a real interest about, can you actually bring your whole self to work? So whilst we talk, a lot of organizations think that they're incredibly progressive when it comes to women. But actually, when you speak to the experience of being a woman in the organization, the culture is different. So while you've got progressive policies, it's really the culture that impacts how women are. And being honest about that, can you really bring your whole self to work? So for example, when I was pregnant with my daughter, my first child, I worked for a Big Four organization. It was very progressive, or thought it was very progressive about women and women's rights. Yeah, I did not tell anyone I was pregnant until I was 6 months pregnant. I was doing a new role. I didn't want to be sidelined. I didn't want people to not do what I was trying to push it into doing. And so it was much easier for me to avoid that by not telling people I was pregnant. Thankfully, it was winter, so I could hide my bump under baggy jumpers. And I remember having to tell people at the Christmas party that I was going to be 8 months pregnant by the time I came back after Christmas. So there's something about, even if you are a progressive organization, what is the reality of being a woman in that organization? Look at the career trajectory, look at the gender pay gap, look at how people are performance managed. But, you know, discrimination and the experience of being a woman, right, can be, you know, negative, even in an organization that thinks it's doing things right. You know, kind of, I think that's the key here, that just because you say you're doing it great and you're looking after women doesn't mean you necessarily are. And you only will find that out by speaking to women within the organization. Yeah. So what can you do? You can do focus groups with women, with different groups, with mothers, with carers, with people with chronic illnesses, all sorts, right? So understanding what's happening. Rewriting policies from a women's perspective. So we tend to have a standalone policy on varying things that's designed for men and women. You know, it's looking through all of the policies we've got from a woman's point of view and adding specific policies to support women. So I've just talked about the menstruation one, fertility one. We're seeing pregnancy loss policies start to come in, which is great. But all the evidence shows that unless you make paternity leave mandatory, it's the women that still tend to take joint parental leave. So there is an impact on women's health if men are forced to take paternity leave, because what we're finding is that men tend not to. When you've got a health and wellbeing program, a lot of health and wellbeing programs that I see and mental health programs are one shot fits all. They're sort of like mental health is a thing. It's not actually a thing that's articulated different for women and men. So in your health and wellbeing program, I think there's lots of things you can do, like promotion and prevention activities, including menstrual cycle awareness, understanding bodies, menopause, hormonal understanding, giving specific nutrition and activity advice on supporting women's bodies. You know, we're seeing more fertility advice and support, but broader health interventions and providers. I still see what in my work that actually a wellbeing strategy is a wellbeing strategy to everyone. And actually there's a lot of chat about men's health at the moment because men need to talk about mental health. We're actually missing the fact that we're not really weaving in the women's stuff. So yeah, it's a broader health interventions and providers and looking at the employee life cycle from a woman's perspective. You know, we still live in a world where the kind of peak of people's careers is between about 35 and 45, which is when a lot of women lose momentum if they're having children. Likewise, the employee life cycle and what it's like, what each touch point is in the employee life cycle. So what is each touch point with a woman on the firm and how is that different from men? So looking through the whole, like how one works from a woman's perspective. Sarah, you've said you've worked in some very male-dominated industries with old school management, and you've had colleagues try to intimidate you due to their size. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, that is the reality in a lot of industries now. Like change is coming, but slowly. And Becca, you're saying policies are great, but using them usually means having certain conversations that make you feel exposed and vulnerable. We have a fertility policy, but then a woman has to share that she's trying to get pregnant undergoing treatment. Absolutely. And that's why I think if you build into a health and well-being program, a discussion around menstrual cycle awareness that men come to as well, not just women, and hormonal understanding, and you're discussing it the whole way through your business, you're changing the culture, which means that actually it's less exposing and vulnerable when you're talking about it. But the fertility policy is a great example because women do get discriminated against. I mean, if you've had a miscarriage, you're more likely to get discriminated against than if you have not, because people then think, okay, this person's trying to get pregnant. And yeah, it's a real challenge. If you're trying to get pregnant or going through IVF, you've got to come forward. And then, yeah, in the wrong culture, that means discrimination. So I am with you on that. It's a tricky balance, but one that I think we can only do by chipping away at culture and having these sorts of conversations. I think that's the only way you can actually do it, making it normal. Health providers. So there's a lot of femtech out there now. I've got a slide on that. These are all sort of things that make healthcare more accessible to women. So I've talked about period apps. I've talked about Jessica and her training app, but there's things about female orientated advice. I think Peppy is a one for fertility, but yeah, making sure that also in our health providers that we have, that there is specific support for women and around women things. Flexibility, so core hours, giving women the opportunity to work with their body, both in terms of circadian rhythm, but also in terms of where they are during their month. Working from home policies, holiday policies, duvet menstruation days, and peer support, right? So the workplace, especially because women, what has happened is that women have joined the male workforce. We have not redesigned the workplace for women. What has happened is that women have joined a work environment that is for men. So the way to change that is to have conversations, have women's circles, listening partnerships are where you're paired up with somebody and you can talk about how you feel and you're listened to, vice versa. Reverse mentoring, line manager relationships, all of those things. Heather, you've said it's a good job. There is a shortage of workers. Otherwise, they just wouldn't employ women as it's harder work. Yes, it is. But actually, all of the evidence shows that if you firstly, women, people are working longer, so there's more women in the workforce. Secondly, women have different skills. There's a lot of evidence that shows that some of the management and leadership style skills that women have can actually impact the bottom line and the productivity of an organization. I think it's true to say that, that it is, a lot of people do that. Oh, well, it's a lot easier to just not employ women, especially if they're childbearing age. I think that's less easy to do now, but I also feel like there's we're talking about half the population now. So Amy, you've put about organizations need to reflect. If no one's talking about it, raising it, then it doesn't cease to exist. I was always amazed at when the gender neutral toilets came in. I worked at an organization that just pulled out their own policies, and every time there was a word in there, they just changed he or she to kind of a non-gendered word. Just like it's a lot easier to just sort of stick gender neutral signs on toilets, not to look at the workplace through the eyes of different groups. Yeah, so I think that's the key here. It's about looking at the workplace through different groups. Bridie, you've put pain relief for female procedures is massive. Why are women expected to undergo traumatic invasive treatments with little or no pain relief? Well, that is purely misogyny is the answer to that, and I agree. And Sarah, yeah, the same with disabilities. Like, what I'm trying to get across here is that with all of these things, whether it's disabilities, whether it's mental health, whether it's men's mental health, whether it's women's mental health, it's about looking at the workplace from that demographic and seeing how we can tweak it. And the trouble we've got with the Invisible Women book says this, is that we have put women into a male-dominated workforce. We've not redesigned it to actually work, and it's just not really working anymore. Right, so types of health providers, that you can bring in: GP services that specialize in female health conditions, gynecologists, pelvic physiotherapists, breast screening, smear testing, female-focused health assessments, even health assessments just look at bodies as if they're the same, whether they're male and female, fertility services and femtech. Femtech, I covered this before. There's a big rise in femtech. Femtech is becoming large. It is still really small compared to the amount of medtech out there, but it's definitely becoming bigger, and it enables care delivery of healthcare to women, more women to be able to do self-care, the stigmatized areas you can look at more, and delivering culturally sensitive and tailored care. That's the kind of thing that you can do with your femtech. I said that I would recommend you some books. The Bible on health, women's health and mental health, is Christine Northrup's Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom, that I'm holding up now, if you can see me. That is the Bible. Every woman should have one. I have bought a copy for every female in my life. Alexandra Pope, I've done a lot of work with Alexandra over the years. She was really the first person to look at the menstrual cycle and the seasons. So she is great to start. And Lara Bryden has got this brilliant book called The Period Repair Manual, which is a sort of one-stop shop for understanding what's going on in your hormones and dealing with issues. So Hormone Repair Manual is her latest book, which looks at perimenopause. But I'll give you an example. After I had my second child, my hair fell out for 2 years. So the hair loss that you have after pregnancy continued and continued and continued. And I got very concerned about it. I went to the gynecologist, I went through the GP, I went to every source I could because I was freaking out that I was losing my hair and no one could help me. I read Lara Brydon's book, and she has a load of questions at the back and a load of stuff. I basically realized through this book that I didn't have enough zinc and iron in my diet and it was affecting my hormones. So I managed to self-diagnose that, started taking iron and zinc supplements, and it stopped. So the thing is that gynecologists and GPs often don't know a lot about women's health and mental health either, because the research hasn't been done. So sadly, we're having to do our own research on that. And Lara Brydon and Alexandra Pope are good places to start, as is Christine Northrup. But Lara really focuses on hormones. Maya Dusenberg, Doing Harm, that's one of a number of books that are out there now about women's chronic illness and their experience of the healthcare system. Lucy Pearce does a lot on cycles as well. And then all of the other books here are just ones that I love because they're all feminist books. Margaret Heffernan writes a lot about women in the workplace. Mary Beard is about the history of women. And then Maureen and Carol are different aspects of female. So the book, so just to go through some questions, femtech. So you find unisex toilets are only good if they include all sanitary bins, which they often don't. I find it disappointing. They're also a bit easier, we'll just rebadge all the toilets as no sex as opposed to actually looking at it from a different perspective. I find it disappointing that most of the negative attitudes I've experienced are from other older women in management positions. Lorraine, you've hit the nail on the head here, which is that I think women who've adapted into the male workforce are often worse to women than the men are. I think maybe in order to be accepted themselves, it's showing no slack on the women underneath them. The book that I recommended, the Margaret Heffernan one, she wrote a wonderful book where she talks about women in the workforce becoming one of 4 archetypes. Either the bitch, the guy, the invisible woman, or the geisha who serves everyone. And it's interesting, whenever I've worked in large organizations, you see as women get more senior, they tend to adopt one of those archetypes. And it's very sad, but that's why I love doing this work, because by having this conversation, hopefully we're making it easier for women to support each other. Bridie, femtech is basically any sort of form of medical technology that's focused on women. And female gynae experts, fascinating. My partner went for a vasectomy a couple of years ago, and he went through 3 or 4 different appointments where each of them he was told by female gynecologists and doctors that he shouldn't be having the snip. I should be having a coil fitted. And I did have a coil fitted at one point, and the woman doctor very pointedly said to me that I should keep it in until I had menopause, despite the fact that it was causing me pain and giving me awful periods, because it was much better for me to do that than my partner have the snip, which he wanted. I mean, he was shocked at his experience of women doctors trying to talk him out and saying that I was the one that was mad fact, So Sally, the book was called Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom. This is her first book. She's written lots since, but this is basically the Bible of kind of where to start reading about any of this stuff. Sal, GPs only get a few hours of training on menopause. I mean, you actually can do a lot of more reading about menopause than you would if you spoke to a gynecologist, sadly. Lorna, that's very sweet, thank you. I'm glad that you've learned something. And I just don't think with biology we really cover any of this stuff. Yes, that's completely right, Georgia. Black women are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women, because not only is there the misogyny, but there's also the racism. And also, if you are a Black woman, you're less likely to be given pain relief during birth as well, which is just terrible. How do we fight for women's healthcare and women's rights without getting called a TERF? I don't know the answer to that, Marina. Sometimes I feel like I'm sticking my neck on the line talking about women's rights, but I really strongly feel about it, because I feel like the conversation should be about how women and transgender people should get more of the male pie, not be scrapping over the small bit of pie that women get. And it is a challenge that. I've had talks where I've been talking about miscarriage and menstruation, where the first question has been how I make transgender people feel included in a talk about miscarriage. And I'm like, well, of course you're welcome, but kind of like it's a talk about miscarriage. I wouldn't go to a talk on prostates. I might go out of interest, but I wouldn't then be offended that the talk on prostates wasn't aimed at me because I don't have a prostate, right? So I think there's I try and avoid gender identity discussions, but I think this women's health stuff is so important. Amy, you've said there are any generational differences. Yeah, I love working with younger people. And actually, I kind of feel like a dinosaur at the age of 42 sometimes. Younger people seem to be a lot more inclusive about all of this stuff. My concern about younger people is I don't think they realize we're at the most dangerous place in terms of women's rights. Because it's how do we open up the equality to everyone without losing the fact that women have always had a much smaller piece of pie. And actually, I mean, the very fact that we have 1% on funding on that is something that's really important. And there is a backlash against feminism. I really wonder what the Roe v. Wade outcome will be. I think there was backlash against feminism, but I think what's going on in the States is genuinely scared people that actually we're in that point. Another question, is there any hope with the recent government consultation on women's health? Yes, I went to a women's health report policy launch last year. There was a policy by Public Policies released a report on women's health, which you can download, and they were basically pushing the government. They did it to kind of, the government is about to release a consultation on women's health. But what Public Policy Review were doing with their report on women's health was trying to kind of put the government's feet on the wall to actually do something. So yes, we're moving in this way and the government is doing things. And there's Caroline Noakes now is an MP who's actually a women's health MP. She chairs the Women's Inequality Committee. So we're moving there, but it's just really slow, really slow. And yeah, Sarah, the gendered approach, it's a body approach. That's how I try to say it as well. It's yeah, I mean, like, my view on this stuff is anyone's welcome to come. And I was really pleased, I'm going to embarrass him, but to see Matthew here, because it's sort of like, I think what worries me about women's health is that it's often women talking about women's health without male allies. So when I do women's health stuff within the organizations, I try to encourage it to be for everyone, because I think, women should not be trying to change things for women. It should come from both sides. I mean, we cannot have a situation where 50% of the population doesn't know their own bodies or health. And Matthew, I'm really glad that you came as well. So thank you. Let me just finish off. So what I am doing, yeah, I'm seeing a lot more of this sort of thing happening, and I'm seeing a lot more people weaving in women's health to their policies. This is me. I'm on LinkedIn. I do a lot on LinkedIn, but I do a lot of women's health stuff on LinkedIn as well. So if you have any questions or you want those books, I know that Heather is going to share this video so you can rewatch it and the books are there. But if you've got any questions, you can email me, or on LinkedIn, I often do quite a lot of stuff on women as well. I'm going to stop sharing my slides. So if anyone has a question, I'll happily answer it in the 10 minutes we've got left, but hopefully that was helpful. Thank you, Jay. Yeah, so does anyone else have anything else they want to ask or say around women's health and mental health, or any more questions? You can unmute yourself if you like, or wave at me. Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, we've got a couple of minutes, so, don't be shy. But I think it's a really interesting thing. And if you're in your jobs, I'm really concerned about my field at the moment, because there's a lot of chat about men and so mental health is like, it's either being dressed up as a male leadership issue, or it's like we need to get men to talk about mental health, and it's becoming the sort of men's thing, the men's club on mental health. I think the women's thing is huge and really needs to be addressed. Yeah. So go, learn, read, fine.
Thank you very much, Amy. I am absolutely reeling from all of that amazing information, and I'm just like, I think I have found my soulmate in Amy. Because this is the kind of stuff I also try and take forward into, the legal world, which is not particularly enlightened in this field. So I'm sure we can talk offline about a lot of stuff. I think when Heather and I were first discussing an event around this topic, she said, I know exactly who to speak on this. Amy bangs the drum on this. And I think what we all need to do now is bang the drums in our own organizations, just to go back and become, a bit more curious about, right, we have our wellbeing policies, mental health policies, how have those been put together? Can we improve on them? Looking at all of the things that Amy's kind of pointed us to today. So absolutely fantastic, Amy. Thank you so much for sharing all of your learnings and observations. Obviously, people can contact Amy on the details she sent, and we'll circulate your details, Amy.
Put asked about training or resources. A really good place to start in terms of women's cycle is if you go onto Red School. That's Alexandra's website. She does a lot of e-courses now, but she does a lot on understanding cycles and seasons and things. There's also a lady called Claire who runs a company called, I think, We Thrive, who does quite a bit on women's health. I do quite a bit on women's health. But yeah, and a really good place to look as well is that report that I mentioned. Thank you for whoever put about the government one. But if you go onto Public Policy Review, you can download their women's health report that came out. I mean, it covers a lot of the areas we've talked about, and also that McKinsey one I talked about at the start. They're all really good resources to start and just start thinking about it. But also my experiences is like, I mean, I'm a northerner, right? So I have worked in large organizations. I tell people, I'm day one of my cycle, I feel terrible, I'm going home. No one has ever flinched. Right. So it's just starting. Something we can all do now is starting to weave into our general chat, things like that. I find that when you actually talk like that, people respond to it, even men. Men, the planet is run by 50% of people are women. Right. If you're talking about it, people generally respond. It's just that we just don't.
Yeah, agreed. We have to, in some way, start to try and put aside some of the ways that we would normally behave and get into those new habits. I think definitely. Yeah. Brilliant. So the session was recorded. So if you've got any colleagues, anybody else you think would really benefit from the session, you'll be able to send the link on to them, Heather, won't you? It's not kind of restricted to the membership. But if they also want to join up for the Women in Health and Safety Forum, and that is open to both women and men, please encourage them to do so, because we always have lots of good events kind of coming in the pipeline. Heather has sent around the link to the feedback form, so can I just ask people to take a minute to fill that out? Otherwise, if there's not any other questions, we'll all just send our thanks subliminally through the screen to Amy. Absolutely fantastic session. Any follow-up, contact Amy or through us and we'll put you in contact.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for your time and energy and chats and stuff.